Welcome to Shades of Us. I'm your host, Darryl Brown. If recent events have taught us anything, it's important for everyone to be at the table, especially those groups historically marginalized.
As we celebrate Black History this month, let's hear from a few Americans who are creating open spaces for diversity and inclusion of all people.
In today's mainstream culture, throwing shade can imply snarkiness or using a sharp tongue in a humorous way to get a message across. In our next segment, we meet a so-called shady historian who uses his wit to tell stories on behalf of POC and the LGBTQ community.
I wanted to really have a framing of presenting a historical story that was not necessarily something that you always see, something that really is always kind of shade, you know? It kind of goes into like the places of history that we necessarily don't always see or think about. My name is Bo Lancaster. I am an NYU graduate student studying history, specialization queer history in America. I'm also a native-born New Yorker, prom Bronxite, boogie down. Somehow or another, I found myself in the middle of Brooklyn, and I'm also the creator of Shady Historian.
The Shady Historian is a YouTube channel which focuses on queer, people of color history. As a nation begins to grapple with its history of its racist past, which aka really means that white people actually rediscovering that racism is an authentic experience for everyone else, there has been more focus on really also revamping our curriculum as it relates to the history that we teach our kids.
Shade can double as, you know, something that history is naturally just uncovering itself, you know, the history of POC queer people or POC history in general in the United States is always undertoned and not shown. Shade as a concept is, you know, within gay male culture is always kind of humorous, and I fall within the categories of that clearly.
John Brown is one of the most controversial figures in all of American history. And by all of American history, I mean all, like seriously, all of history.
I was working as an educator in quite a few education, youth development nonprofits throughout New York City. And primarily I worked with teenagers. The young kids who I would work with at times, the young kids of color who were queer, they would just start to come into their own selves. And they had, you know, a real difficulty in really seeing themselves in queer spaces. Looking back at my own developmental phase, I started to notice like, it'd be good if they actually knew a little bit more about their own history, a little bit more about their own focus, a little bit more about their own community.
There was always people like Martin Luther King that they would talk about, and they would talk about, depending on your t-shirt, job security, Malcolm X, right?
Bayard Rustin.
You don't really hear too much about him, and that's because he was ran out of narrative, because he was gay. Rustin was a strategist, he was a leader, he was on the ground doing the community organizing work. So instrumental, and you don't hear about him. And part of the reason you don't hear about him is because he's gay. I think it would be really cool if, you know, I found that out a lot earlier, that I wasn't 20 years old when I discovered that.
I would say ever since the 2016 presidential election, people really started to investigate more into telling historical stories and into really looking for authentic historical information. And I feel that 2020 was like that big, huge moment with George Floyd's murder. And people really started to try to figure out the sociological groundbreaking of America itself.
So Reconstruction occurs in the United States. The economy of the South is completely devastated. Union generals, they come through, they burn down the city of Atlanta. Slavery as an institution is abolished.
I think about the story with my family when I found out that my great-great-grandfather was a Civil War Union soldier. It was interesting because he also was the first member of my family on either one of my sides, my mother and my father's side, who actually was registered to vote. So, you know, how we turned that episode into family investigation, but also into a real rallying cry for voting rights.
For a brief period of his life as a young adult, he got to taste real freedom to vote, to begin to earn an economic significant income outside of himself. And it would take his descendants a very long time to get to that same point that he was at. So when I was researching this episode about his life and about this dark chapter of American history and seeing the parallels between them, I was disturbed because I don't want us to slip back into that.
A young slave boy stood one day before the greatest ruler of his day. And God said to Moses, "What's in your hand?"
There's a really great speech by Adam Clayton Powell Jr. when he was a congressman. He was a congressman who represented Harlem for much of the civil rights movement. And, you know, he talks about what's in your hands. At the end of the day, what do you have in your hands? What is the opportunity that you have? And, you know, that's how I felt a year and a half ago. It was like, what do I have in my hands? How can I actually build something, anything? I don't care if it's no one watching me do it. I'm going to do it, you know?
According to a 2003 annual review of sociology report on U.S. migration, during the 20th century, African Americans participated in one of the most significant demographic events in U.S. history, the Great Migration from the South to the North. It contributed to profound social, economic, and cultural changes in northern cities.
The power of storytelling for women and being represented in that story is what Sylvia Wong Lewis uses in discovering her family identity and documenting it in her film.
I just wanted to let people know that there's a lot of life after 50 years old and that you can still do so much. My name is Sylvia Wong Lewis. I'm the owner and manager of a media platform called Narrative Network. The Narrative Network has been around for 15 years, and it started as my retirement project about storytelling. And so really started as a blog. Narrative Network is now in the process of producing a film festival called Auntyland Film Festival. We also are producing on a platform called auntyland.com and 1619brooklyn.com. The film festival actually launches on March 8th, which is International Women's Day. It's a day that recognizes globally women's work. The film festival really came out of the quarantine. I started thinking about my ancestors and my friends and people, and I was thinking about all of the stories that were unwritten. And so I thought, I think that I could take Auntyland, which had already been established. That's a platform for stories about aunts, mostly multicultural aunts. And that's my goal, is to connect the generations. I come from a multicultural, multi-ethnic background. My father's people are from the South, the American South, and they're from Mississippi and Louisiana. So that's one set of my family. And then the other side of my family, my mother's side, they're Chinese West Indian, actually Chinese Trinidadian. And then there comes to me. I'm almost 70 years old. I come up in a generation that comes out of the civil rights era and the Black arts movement. I became a filmmaker late in life, actually, and it was in my role as an aunt that it happened. So that's kind of how I named my company Auntyland, because I was just minding my business one day and I got a call from a young lady. She said, "Hello, you don't know me, but you're my aunt. I'm your niece." And I said, "Oh, really?" I said, "Where have you been all these years?" And she said, "Oh, I've been in foster care." And then she says, "Could you tell me who I am?" I mean, she had all these questions. And then she said, "And what were my grandparents like?" Meaning my parents. So I created a film called Shanghai to Harlem as a way to explain what our family was, who our family was. It's a immigration and a migration story. Part of that story is slavery too. So, and I'm very interested in slavery. Our family was part of that. I'm a descendant of enslavers and enslaved people. and you look at my face and you say, what is she? And I'm a combination, a result of that history. That's what I am. And why are those Chinese people in Trinidad? They went there because they were indentured servants. And why did they need indentured servants in the Caribbean? Because the enslavement of Africans was outlawed. I'm telling world history stories, but also sharing our family. My grandfather and my grandmother, who I talk about in my film, they came to New York in 1919 during the Harlem Renaissance. When you talk about Shades of Us, African-American people, we're like the most successful Black people in the world in a lot of ways because of what we went through and what we have triumphed and what we have achieved. I am a BIPOC person, Black, Indigenous, person of color. The world needs our stories. And why do they need our stories? Because they don't really know our stories. A lot of times other people are telling our stories, and they're telling a very narrow narrative about us, about our story, about our history, about our experience. And the white male patriarchal structure has control over a lot of our lives. That's why I welcome men of color, Black men, African-American men, Latin men, to tell their stories, to share their stories with Auntie Land, because we can just look at the news every day and see that it's a different life for a male of color from childhood to adulthood. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to share our stories with our families and friends. And I mean about everything. And I'm so excited that the digital landscape allows for that. I do like people to understand that Lower Manhattan was the original Harlem of New York, because this is where we started. This whole area of Tribeca was really the Black community. It was called the Land of Blacks.
And I did a lot of genealogy work, and I would say,
when I think about my parents' legacy and my grandparents' legacy, all we have are their stories and their pictures and their documents and things like that. Right now, I'm in the middle of archiving, pulling together my husband's archives for a museum. And that's what they look at. They look in your archives at your legacy. When I was growing up, children were seen and not heard. We could have all the thoughts we wanted to have, but we really weren't free to just express ourselves. So I'm feeling very optimistic that young people are telling more stories and sharing more stories about their lives. And they're really teaching us a lot, and we have a lot to learn. I'm hoping that the film festival and Auntie Land in general will help just support a way to keep the generations mixing with each other and connecting with each other.
According to a 2011 study on music, lesbian and gay students may feel a greater sense of safety and belongingness in music than in other classes.
Free and open space is also great for music. Meet a cellist who, along with her organization Chamber Queer, are creating an alternative and inclusive LGBTQ+ space within New York City's classical music community.
LGBTQIA people have always existed in classical music, but I think rarely has our difference been welcomed, embraced, or even celebrated until pretty recently. Hi, my name is Jules Biber, and I am a cellist and teacher. I'm an adjunct assistant professor in the music department at Hunter College. CUNY has been a pretty steady part of my life for the past number of years. I got my DMA, my doctorate in musical arts, essentially the equivalent of a PhD, at the Grad Center. I started to teach at various campuses. I started at City College and ended up at Hunter, where I teach chamber music. I teach history, I've taught theory, I teach some private lessons. Chamber music is essentially like a conversation among friends. The name chamber music implies that it's played in a small space. So it's essentially an ensemble that can fit in a living room. And it's existed in classical music from very early on in its history. Growing up in the classical music world, I had a very standard sort of education in classical music. I grew up outside of Boston. My dad listened to music a lot when I was a kid, and he was very encouraging of me to start an instrument. I had been rummaging through the attic as a kid, and there was this strange looking large instrument up there that I was very fascinated by. And I asked my dad what it was. He said it was a cello. And I said, oh. Me and my cello, we've been buddies for a really, really long time. It's taken me on adventures. It's taken me around the world. I was really very much conservatory trained. This very kind of old trajectory of learning and playing. You study with someone who's a master at what they do, and you emulate them, and you follow in that same sort of path, right? It can be quite limiting in some ways. One of the things, as I sort of realized that I was gay, I was queer, I started to feel that sense of otherness and difference, even from the simplest kinds of things as, dress codes for concerts. It's like women wear skirts, men wear pants. It's this very gendered kind of world that still exists. The general idea behind Chamber Queer is that we want to program queer artists and composers, and we want to highlight historically underrepresented queer figures in classical music and really create an inclusive and intersectional space for everybody. That means performers and audiences alike. Chamber Queer doesn't have a physical location, at least right now. The Chamber Queer founders work mostly through email. We have meetings. That's how we sort of get things done. We perform in a variety of spaces, they run the gamut. So we play in traditional concert halls, we play in bars, we play on the sidewalk. Especially during COVID, we've been doing a lot of outdoor concerts. We play primarily in Brooklyn and Manhattan. We did some shows through the Open Streets Project, which was a city-run program that paired artists with locations around the city to perform. I feel the happiest and the most fulfilled when I have a happy balance between performing and teaching. The most learning that I do as a performer and as learning as a person is through my teaching, right? So I learn a lot from my students. Hopefully my students learn a lot from me. I think the future is bright for classical queer musicians. And, we just want to carry on the conversation that's sort of starting to happen all over the arts right now, and embracing difference, embracing diversity. Doing all these sort of projects, Chamber Queer, and just sort of my own personal endeavors, it makes me feel great. I love helping people feel safe and comfortable, because I think I've had my share of experience feeling uncomfortable in certain spaces and environments. This place and these people embrace me for exactly who I am. I don't need to change myself to engage with this event or this performance. I can be exactly who I am. So we have a number of upcoming events. Our main sort of flagship event every year is our Pride Festival in June. This year it's going to be taking place over 3 days, June 10th through 12th, with a concert at National Sawdust on the 10th and also the 12th in the evening. And on that Saturday in between, the 11th, we're going to have a daytime show at Branded Saloon in Brooklyn. We'll also be hosting a number of community events, which we do throughout the year as well. Some of them are online, some of them are in person. My goal and Chamber Queer's goal is to just make everyone feel welcome, and in our specific world, classical music, there's a lot of work to be done. We'll continue to create space and concerts and programming that promote the work of queer artists. And hopefully, people, other organizations, and will follow suit.
According to an April 2021 Pew Research Center survey, 9 out of 10 U.S. adults favor some form of marijuana legalization.
Few would argue that Black Americans have suffered the most throughout America's decades-long war on drugs. But marijuana's moment has arrived, and states are seeing that change is needed, even before the federal government gets fully on board.
I'm Natalie Papillon. I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Last Prisoner Project, which is a national not-for-profit that's focused on cannabis-related criminal justice reform.
Hi, my name is Tahir Johnson, and I'm the host of the Cannabis Diversity Report podcast. Also serve in other roles at the U.S. Cannabis Council and the Marijuana Policy Project, where I focus on increasing social equity and diversity in the cannabis industry.
There's a common misconception in the American public that no one's still in jail for weed, right? And while incarceration for cannabis has gone down over the years, that couldn't be further from the truth. So there's still tens of thousands of people who cycle through jails and prisons every year because of nonviolent marijuana-related offenses. In fact, it remains one of the largest arrest categories in the entire country, despite the momentum behind state-level legalization.
Man, I've been pulled over myself dozens of times myself in my life. Been arrested for cannabis personally. Had friends and family who have. When you think about the ways that an arrest can damage someone's life, it makes it more difficult for them to have professional careers. Just even think about in college, you could lose your financial aid for having a cannabis charge, right? People's children being taken away.
So a couple of things have happened over the past few years, whether it's because of the pandemic or because of heightened awareness about racial justice stemming from the George Floyd murder and the aftermath there, that have made my job a little different from before. I think on the pandemic front, one thing we're seeing is a lot of cannabis businesses, so state-regulated cannabis businesses, were deemed essential services during the pandemic. And so I think seeing a world in which a governmental authority designates a certain type of commerce as like essential, but at the same time people are being put in jail for it or remain in jail for it, I think that really highlighted just how viscerally unjust our approach to cannabis policy is. And it really animated a lot more movement.
Jobs, man. I think that's one thing that anybody would, especially like New York City, that I would think about. Think about how many jobs it can create, like just with this infrastructure. Leafly's job report last year said that there's over 321,000 full-time jobs in cannabis in the United States. So you think about that in the backdrop of like kind of where we are as a country, like all the different states economically. For one, cannabis was essential, right? So even when at the peak of the pandemic, when a lot of businesses were shut down, the cannabis dispensaries were open. And then also there's just so many different opportunities for this entire infrastructure and careers and jobs around cannabis. And these are good paying full-time jobs that people can have. Cannabis can be a new job creator, especially in a time in the pandemic where a lot of people have chose to like stop working and are looking for new careers and new opportunities as the world is changing. I think it's really important that we make sure people from communities that have been harmed by cannabis historically have the opportunity to share in that. So hopefully cannabis can be something to make a big difference in New York.
We have millions of Americans who are handicapped because of cannabis-related criminal records. And just because now marijuana is legal in their jurisdiction doesn't mean that they have that renewed eligibility for things like public assistance or federally backed loans or things like that. So we also need to prioritize record relief as part of the general cannabis policy reform conversation.
One of the biggest things that's kept people out and makes it so hard for people to have opportunities, access to capital, because cannabis is federally illegal. If you have a cannabis business, whether you're a startup or an established business, you can't go into Bank of America or Wells Fargo and say, you want to get a small business loan to do it. And even just basic things like paying your employees or money orders or checks to pay your bills become things that are super time intensive and difficult for cannabis operators to be able to complete.
It'll be some time before New York sees regulated cannabis sales as they get all of those regulations in place, but we're already seeing really heartwarming signs that cannabis-related criminal justice involvement has plummeted after legalization. So the number of arrests, the number of citations have really gone down, and there's been law enforcement as well as other officials have been really, really amenable to other forms of relief. So we're hoping to see that trajectory continue.
If you ask where the industry's going, that somebody like me can even be in this role, right? And that I exist, that I have the opportunity to help shape what these policies look like, I have the opportunity to create these programs. And it hasn't been perfect, right? But I'm definitely hopeful that as these new places come on board, that like New York and New Jersey, that we can have programs that'll get more people in the industry.
That's our show for now. If you want to know more about the people you saw, log on to our website at tv.cuny.edu. I'm Darryl Brown. See you next time on Shades of Us.